So good morning, everyone. I'm the one who's actually in between you and the break, but I'll try to keep this quick. But before starting, I'd like to acknowledge actually like my members, like my colleagues and friends who have been presenting, like Miguel. Thank you, Miguel, for presenting much of my presentation. So, and Annie, Thao, Lau, and Chris. We're a group of like scientists, social scientists, and science communicators. And if I forget to invoke you, please join us in the VR virtual reality session at the poster session later on. But yes, I'm the social scientist in that group, and I'll be talking a little bit different in terms of like comparison with other presentations earlier on. I'll be talking about land reclamation as an adaptation to sea level rise, the challenges and opportunities, particularly on its social implications. So as a background, this area, Asia, is rapidly urbanizing. 17 of the world's megacities are actually located in this region. It is expected to be 22 by the end of the decade. And of course, as we all know, coastal areas are both havens of opportunities, but also the most at-risk regions. Asia accounts now for more than half of the world's urban population, with the highest number of people living along coastal areas. However, in Asia, you're in Singapore right now. It's a nice place to be in, but the reality is that in other megacities, rapid and unplanned urbanization is taking place. And thus, it leads to widening inequality between rich and the poor, as a result of this rapid urbanization, are starting to intrude into the coastline, exposing them to hazards, as seen in Miguel's presentation earlier. However, the reality is that rapid urbanization and the demand of more land in coastal areas has led the cities around the world to reclaim land from the sea. So, to begin with, reclamation is not new. It's actually been happening for centuries. So some people think that it's a new phenomena, but in reality, 1500s, you have Tokyo having its earliest reclamation in 1522, Singapore in the 1800s. You have Netherlands with long histories of land reclamation. But this now seen as a strategy of like how, especially in the concept of advanced strategy to address sea level rise, either through land reclamation, land filling, and polarization, especially with the recent release of the working group too. However, looking through literature, there's both negative and positive consequences. Improper implementation of land reclamation increases risk to liquefaction. It can serve as a protective buffer zone to coastal hazards. On the negative side again, it may disrupt environmental coastal processes and may lead to environmental deterioration. But there has been new case areas wherein the new land has been serving as a starting point to rehabilitate new coastal zones, especially in post-disaster situations. Of course, it is expensive, time-consuming, and most importantly, socially disruptive. However, and I think this is what drives a lot of local governments to see this as an opportunity to address both climate change issues as well as their urban development issues, is that it does not prohibit construction on the newly created land, thus addressing both population density, increasing economic opportunity, and at the same time addressing future risks. But as I said earlier, I'll show some pictures about how land reclamation has been doing over time. This is a picture of a small hill in Yokohama, and the land that you are seeing here right now is actually reclaimed. So I'm on top of the hill looking downward. All of these residential areas are actually reclaimed. So if I remember correctly, the dating of this, it was like happening in the around 19th century earlier on. But they had maps on this area wherein it depicts that all of this is actually used to be the sea. But on the flip side, you have also new areas. This is taken in Rinkai Park, and you could see that this is also situated in the new areas of new reclaimed areas of Tokyo, wherein you would now see more of the defenses against like the coastal hazards, as well as like environmental areas as well. So reclamation in Tokyo had its history of environmental degradation, but new processes have started to incorporate environmental techniques as well as sustainability concepts. We cannot talk about reclamation without talking about this country, Singapore. The area that we are in right now is actually unreclaimed land, and I think probably you could not see it in the picture. That's probably boat key, and that's the earliest reclamation in Singapore. I think it's around 1822. The Singaporeans can correct me later on. But this has been a model in Southeast Asia in terms of like how we should do reclamation. There's another part. You could look at, I think, to your east, and you would see how land reclamation is sprawled over in the east side of Singapore, and you would see always this natural area before the residential zones. So this is kind of like this nice model that a lot of rapidly developing megacities in Southeast Asia is trying to do or replicate. Miguel has presented a lot about Jakarta earlier on. So I'd like to, of course, you might have seen the Great Garuda seawall. The area that you could see, I think probably on the tail of the Garuda itself, you'd see like this dotted area of like brown. That's actually Pluit. And it's very interesting whenever we see these grand visions of reclamation saying that it's for sea level rise or other coastal hazards, you would see these dotted areas, and they actually represent informal coastal settlements. So you've seen this area in Miguel's picture earlier, so I won't discuss it anymore, of course. So I'll go to Manila, which is my hometown. So Manila is known also for its sunsets. And most people in Manila don't know that this area that you're seeing right now is actually reclaimed. So this is reclaimed around the 1970s. But future thinking forward, there's around 22, 24 reclamation projects in Manila happening on the moment. And in any of these projects, it should be, according to the government, we should incorporate sea level rise, climate change issues, climate change adaptation measures. However, there is this mixed understanding on how reclamation impacts coastal flooding. On one hand, you would see that there's argument that well-designed and properly constructed reclamation projects will prevent flooding. But on the other hand, scientists are also arguing that implementing the planned reclamation activities will actually inundate coastal villages. And in reality, the science is not sure. So earlier on, we had presentation from Climate Central, which is something that's very interesting as well, because both proponents and opponents of reclamation use the same science data set to argue therefore. So the main lesson of this, this presentation is actually to argue on how we should deal and use the science. So I'll move forward. This is my field site. It's one of the planned reclamation areas, but it's also being already reclaimed and being planned to be reclaimed further. In maps, it has been seen that it's actually at risk to both storm surges and tsunamis. But this is one such vision of the future. And this area in Manila, it's called Baseco Compound, is the densest urban coastal informal settlement. So now people are planning towards reclamation, and all of these projects are incorporating coastal defense and sustainability measures. In fact, this new reclamation is seen as a functional mixed-use development designed to be the first quote-unquote smart city, which I doubt, centered around sustainable design. But in reality, in any of these projects, these are the areas of the most vulnerable. They're always under shadow of development. And in reality, these are some pictures on the ground. But we do not have to, we have to remind ourselves that the poor are resilient on their own. And in the case of coastal hazards, sea level rise issues, they will adapt. They will try to adapt even with their modest amount of money. So I think this is a recurring message that our team has been talking about since we've started working together. So some of them would even spend more in order to just raise their floors. So these are the poor. They're not really supported by the government to do this, but they will try to adapt to sea level rise. However, I think the main point here is that how do we create models? How could we influence these developments? And in the past decade, in the Philippines, you had the Typhoon Haiyan disaster in 2013. And of course, Japan and the Netherlands came in and studied the area. In Tacloban, which I don't have a picture here right now, they plan also to use reclamation as part of coastal defense. And very importantly, in one of the reports, recommendation is now to incorporate this strategy, which is a multi-layer safety protection philosophy type of strategy used by Japan and the Netherlands. It depends on how they influence, but the idea is there's multi-layers working together in order to reduce risk. So from the current situation, the idea is to put defenses that would mitigate the risk and to actually allow development to happen. However, I think the reality right now is that the science is taken to actually push visions of the future that actually exacerbate the existing vulnerability of poor people, especially in rapidly developing countries. So in my current research right now, I'm trying to compare 4 areas, basically Tokyo, Singapore, because they have long histories of coastal development and through land reclamation, and how do they actually view climate change strategies and incorporate it. At the same time, try to get the lessons from their history and try to create a framework or a model that could be applied to developing countries. So thus, I would like to end this presentation with these questions. More particularly, what can be learned from the experiences of global cities with long histories of land reclamation here or elsewhere, and projecting it towards the future. However, I think most importantly, I think when we discuss all of these climate scenarios, we have to, we have to take into consideration that when we try to advance forward, when we try to create our pathways forward, we have to make sure that no one gets left behind. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you. Any questions? Table 1.
Nice talk, but I'm just, is it about adapting to sea level rise, or is it really about land scarcity? Because I mean, you present in Singapore, I mean, all the reclamation is driven by a land poor, and also a very big economy. So you talk about the high costs, but yes. I mean, it's affordable. So can you say a little bit about that dimension? I think because the scarcity is what drives, I think in my experience, most reclamation.
Yes, I think you're right. There's this discussion of scarcity, increasing density. So I think in the case of Tokyo, it's very hard to expand towards the south. They try to, it's very dense already. So the option is also to expand seaward. By also expanding seaward, you also create land in highly economical areas. So I think this drives local governments to, push this concept of land reclamation. Now climate change is at the forefront. We have these coastal defense strategies that are, being promoted and implemented. And they're now also incorporating these coastal defense strategies. But we have, I think, there's a very important role of looking back into history. How did Tokyo reconfigure its urban areas after the war, especially after the major disasters in the 1950s? And how did they actually do urban planning? And then try to get that historical lessons, apply it in the context of climate change, and then put it forward. Because I think this is what's lacking, especially in rapidly urbanizing, developing cities, is that they take the science, they take the recommendations of what engineering techniques to use, but totally forgetting that there is a long history of underdevelopment, which is very crucial to address. So what's happening right now, who are able to adapt, especially with these techniques, are basically, at best, the middle class. But in reality, the most poor, the most vulnerable are being left behind with our technologies. So it's more of like a warning, I guess, in this discussion, because I've seen plans that use the sciences that we create actually to weaponize climate change in order to create more vulnerability. So,
okay.
Thank you so much.